The Australian continent is old, and our soils are very fragile. The small percentage of the land that is suitable for agriculture is susceptible to erosion and soil degradation. Wind erosion is a serious problem, especially here in Western Australia, recognised as the windiest state. On average, every 5 years, the majority of our fragile agricultural soils are severely eroded. Our most fertile land is literally blowing away. Dust particles containing the most fertile part of the soil are easily lifted thousands of metres into the air and may be transported hundreds of kilometres. Australian agricultural soils have travelled as far as the New Zealand ice caps. Before we can effectively deal with this pressing problem, we must understand the complex process of wind erosion.
We really need a device where we can measure the property called the shear force, which is the force that lifts up the particles and drives wind erosion. So I guess with our close liaison with Bill Scott at Murdoch University, we got talking about this problem, and Bill had an idea. The idea of the probe is to have it working in blowing soil.
At Murdoch University in Western Australia, research scientists are developing a device which can cheaply and accurately measure erosive wind forces. They aim to discover how wind erosion really works so that farmers can be advised which practices best prevent wind erosion.
We've had some strong winds which has blown away the soil, and the amount of soil removed has been equal to approximately the depth of these standing stalks here.
Wind erosion is a mechanical process. It sorts and removes soil particles depending upon their mass and size. There are three main processes involved in wind erosion: creep, saltation, and dust suspension. Creep refers to the movement of larger, heavier soil particles along the surface of the ground. It is not a major cause of productivity loss, as these bigger, rockier soil particles have little nutrient value. Saltation is the jumping process, which sandblasts the surface and causes a chain reaction. When wind velocities pass a certain threshold, aerodynamic forces lift soil particles into the air in a process similar to that operating on an aircraft wing. The value of this threshold is dependent on the turbulence statistics of the wind and the stability of the ground surface. The soil particle is lifted up and gains the momentum of the horizontal wind stream. When it falls, it crashes to the ground with considerable force, perhaps causing an explosive impact. Dust and soil particles are released into the airstream, some of which will crash to the ground and set off a chain reaction. Dust suspension is the greatest problem. The most fertile parts of the soil are the finest and lightest, and are easily blown thousands of metres into the air and carried for hundreds of kilometres. The smaller, lighter particles, which are extremely rich in nutrients, are the first to move. Significant losses in soil productivity can be experienced with little evidence of wind erosion. During cropping, the soil cover is removed for cultivation. The land is at risk until the crop germinates and develops, which may take 6 to 8 weeks. It's important that cropping is carefully timed to reduce the risk of wind erosion. Cultivation speed is also a crucial factor. Cropping too fast, especially when the soil is dry, can produce significant amounts of dust suspension. Research into wind erosion can provide the Western Australian Department of Agriculture with information on the most efficient and economical ways to prevent erosion. They can then advise farmers on the best practices for soil management, such as when and how should cropping take place, how much stubble needs to be retained to prevent erosion, which type of post-harvest ridging is best, how much grazing can take place before the land is put at risk. To provide accurate information that is relevant to local soil and wind conditions, detailed measurements are needed on the effects of wind turbulence on different soil structures. There is an urgent need for detailed field research. Severe erosion events occur infrequently in nature. Approximately 80% of all erosion in a given year occur as once-off events. The chances of erosive winds being present during an organised field experiment are so small that research scientists have to provide their own. To this end, the Department of Agriculture has developed a portable wind tunnel which can be used to test representative sites across the country. For this testing to be meaningful, it must first be established that the windy conditions produced by the wind tunnel relate to those produced by nature. This requires detailed and accurate data on wind turbulence. Wind turbulence is a complex, dynamic, chaotic phenomenon. It can best be described as spinning three-dimensional blobs. As these spinning eddies get closer to the ground, the larger eddies break up into smaller and smaller eddies. Atmospheric turbulence has scales from thousands of kilometres down to molecular sizes. We need to establish the scale at which wind events are occurring, the size of wind eddies, and the magnitude of the effect. In 1989, Bill Scott's research team at Murdoch University set out to discover how turbulence relates to wind erosion. This would lead to the development of a device that could accurately measure wind turbulence under the harsh sandblasting conditions in which erosion takes place. The turbulence probe is composed of several components: the probe tip, the sensor pack, the digital signal processor, and a laptop computer. The probe tip consists of a bundle of stainless steel tubes carefully machined into a particular shape. The effects of various shaped tips is calculated from theory and tested, and must then be taken into account in the data analysis. Pressure is measured at 5 points on the probe tip. A bundle of tubes conveys pressure from the probe tip to the sensor pack. The chosen length of these tubes optimises the frequency response of the turbulence probe. The sensor pack consists of 3 differential pressure transducers. These are a kind of infrasound microphone that can accurately measure minute pressure fluctuations. Unlike ordinary microphones, these transducers can respond to low-frequency pressure fluctuations and will accurately measure constant, unvarying pressures.
The pressure transducer used in this project is a differential capacitive transducer. It consists of 2 halves of the body clamping a mylar diaphragm between the 2 halves. There is a cavity either side of the diaphragm to allow the diaphragm to move back and forth under the influence of differential pressure applied to the pressure ports. When the mylar diaphragm is subjected to a pressure that pushes the diaphragm in this direction, the capacitance between these 2 plates increases and the capacitance between these 2 plates decreases, and vice versa. When the pressure is in the opposite direction, this one increases and that decreases. These capacitors are put in an AC bridge which is fed with an AC signal, and the output at this point will be a sine wave either in phase in this case or out of phase in this case, depending on which direction the pressure is applied.
The AC signal is amplified and demodulated by this demodulator, which gives us a DC output, which will be positive for a positive phase and negative for a negative phase, and proportional to the output signal.
This is the digital signal processor here. It contains a specialised high-speed computer and electronics for converting voltages from the probe into numbers which can then be processed. This processing involves several stages. It runs a series of models to correct for the behaviour of various parts of the system. The first stage is to correct for the transfer function of the tubing systems. Secondly, we run a model based on the flow over the sphere to account for the shape of the head of the probe. From this we get a measurement of velocity, and from the velocity we can calculate the turbulence statistics.
The digital signal processor computes several statistics: the shear stress, the mean velocity, the turbulence level, and the autocorrelation. The autocorrelation provides a measure of the size of the eddies.
If you imagine an eddy taking 1 second to be blown past the sensor, then that will cause some kind of correlation of the scale 1 second. So by measuring the autocorrelation function, it gives us a measure of the time scale of the eddies involved in the turbulence. When you combine the timescale measurement with the mean velocity, this gives a measurement of the length scale of the eddies involved.
The digital signal processor is controlled by a laptop computer. The laptop downloads its software, tells it when to start recording a run, and stores and displays the data it produces. This whole system is very portable and can easily be used by researchers in the field.
This day, with the use of the wind tunnel, we're intending to calibrate the velocity probe with both a pitot tube assembly, which measures the velocity profile, and also with a hot wire probe that will be measuring the turbulence very close to where the velocity probe sets. We should be able to measure the wind speed at various levels and get a profile. We should be able to measure the shear stress at various levels and get a profile of shear stress from both the velocity probe and also from the hot wire probe. With little luck, we may be able then to also get some turbulence spectra and some integral scales.
The Murdoch Wind Turbulence research team have done extensive field testing with the Department of Agriculture to evaluate the turbulence probe.
I think field trips are very important in evaluating this kind of modelling. In the laboratory it's very easy to control the conditions under which we work, but in order to simulate an event you have to really know what's going on, and I think it's fairly questionable as to whether people actually do know what happens in wind eroding conditions.
To establish the reliability and accuracy of the turbulence probe, they've compared it to other measurement devices, such as the gill anemometer, the bivane anemometer, and the hot wire anemometer.
Hot wire anemometers have been used in the past to do this work, but they cannot be used where there is dust. And what we're trying to show is that this system works as well as a hot wire system. That hot wire systems have credibility. If we can show that this system works as well, then people will use it.
This is the working part of a hot wire anemometer. You can probably see on the end there's 4 prongs there. Each pair of prongs has an extremely fine wire attached to it, and those wires are heated up to about 250 to 300 degrees centigrade. And the idea behind it is that as the wind flows over the wire, it takes some of the heat away, it cools it off. And by measuring the amount of power that has to go into the wire to keep it at that temperature, you get a measure of how fast the wind is going.
The hot wire anemometer is the standard measure of turbulence. It's been used by researchers for 50 years. The hot wire sensors are easily broken and expensive to replace. The hot wire anemometer system costs twice as much as the velocity probe and does not have its flexibility. The digital signal processor that comes with the velocity probe can be used to run both the probe and the hot wire bridge.
With the probe we've measured turbulence, and we've had a correlation of 0.95 with the hot wire system. We've measured velocities and we've had a correlation of 0.99 with the pitot tube system. It's obvious that we now have a system, a single system, that will measure both turbulence and velocity reliably at one time. So the point is that we have a device that's more stable than the hot wire, has some of the stability characteristics of a pitot tube, which is inherently stable. It's a primary standard. And it has some of the characteristics of the hot wire, that is, it can measure a lot of the frequencies, the lower frequencies, it certainly can measure them. The important frequency in wind erosion are the lower frequencies.
The research carried out has already produced results with important applications for both wind tunnel design and the comparability of these artificial winds to those occurring in natural erosion events.
The main thing that we found in the tunnel, which is considered important by researchers in the field, is the shear stress and the shear stress variations down the tunnel. It was very high near the front end of the tunnel and decreased as you go down the tunnel. The fact that the turbulence at the upstream side of the tunnel was very large. This suggested that, in fact, in the construction of the tunnel, some error was made.
The large shear stresses indicates that the erosion produced by the tunnel for a given wind speed would be grossly disproportionate, perhaps 1,000-fold higher than erosion produced by the same wind speed under natural conditions.
Measurements with a probe for the first time have allowed us to calculate the autocorrelation coefficient, and then from the autocorrelation coefficient get an indication of how large the eddies are. The eddy scale found in the measurements in the wind tunnel with erosion and without erosion is quite a bit smaller than the eddy scale found in nature. The implication of this is that in generating equations for wind erosion, the scale of the equation will be totally different. It's like using a different yardstick, different measure. In terms of practicalities, in terms of measurement of erosion on the paddock, this means that the wind tunnel itself doesn't exactly represent the wind as found in nature.
The turbulence probe has made possible for the first time the evaluation of wind turbulence in sandblasting conditions. The results obtained indicate that the turbulence values and integral scales present under these conditions are significantly different from those occurring when sand particles were not present.
I think it's possible that we've actually discovered, or we may have seen something quite new, something that could not have been found unless we had our probe available. In normal conditions, the spectrum of turbulence is a continuum. But in the case when there's wind erosion, we've found that there's a tendency for a window or a hole in the spectrum. This means that the erosion process is linked somehow with this window. We may now be able to use this to mitigate against or remove some of the problem that occurs with wind erosion. In particular, if we can remove those energies that help out with the erosion process, we may then be able to remove some of the erosion itself.
The existence of a definitive frequency may mean that if soil ridging of a corresponding size is used, soil losses due to wind erosion may be minimized during the cropping process, and the fertility of our fragile soils may be preserved.